Morning. Steve's out of town, and thankful for the opportunity to be able to speak to you this morning. Really enjoy being in the pews and hearing Steve's lessons. Does a great job. For those of you who don't know, I was a full-time minister for nearly 8 years, so it's kind of a nice change of pace to be able to listen to a lot of sermons. But I do like to preach still, so thankful for the opportunity this morning. We're going to talk about something today that Paul says is of first importance. I shared in a Facebook group this morning to a group of mostly other preachers. I don't get this opportunity much to preach anymore, so when I do, I think more about what I'm going to talk about. I'm more careful about the topics that I pick. And so today I wanted to pick a topic that Paul said was important, and that Paul said, in fact, was of first importance. And that is the topic of the death of death. First, I have some good news for you. I don't know if you knew this or not, but the slide doesn't change. Good news for you this morning. I don't know if you knew this or not, but the slide still doesn't change. So, Michael's going to change it for me. Elvis is alive. All the anticipation, all the waiting. The slide didn't change, but this is it. Elvis is alive. You see him right there? It's either Elvis or Santa Claus, but he's alive. Have you heard this before? Now, if you believe this, I'm not saying it's not true. All right? I'm not saying Elvis isn't alive. But for a lot of us, it's pretty difficult to believe, right? I mean, this public figure that everybody knew about, of course, his death was very public. And it was such a long time ago now that it's just a little hard to believe that this man could still be alive. And yet the stories still persist, and there are still people who believe it. But man, what a difficult thing. If I just came to you not in this format, just walked up to you in all seriousness and said, hey, I just saw Elvis, the real guy, the real Elvis. How likely, really, would it be that you believe me? What about this next guy? Osama bin Laden was killed, according to reports, by Navy SEALs. But there are people who still think that he's alive. A little different than Elvis. Elvis, of course, was popular and famous. Osama was also famous, but not so popular. This infamous guy, his death publicized everywhere. If I came to you and said, I just saw Osama bin Laden in my neighborhood, how likely would it be that you believe me? Darcy says no with her eyes. Can you imagine then, in Jesus' day, in the first century, can you imagine a man like Jesus who was as popular, famous as Elvis? I mean, the crowds loved him. He went everywhere, and people rushed to meet him. Huge crowds that he couldn't even get through, couldn't even walk through because there were so many people. Jesus was so famous and so well known, and yet he was also infamous. I mean, in the end, he was a criminal in the eyes of a lot of people. Died a criminal's death on a cross, which is just the equivalent of the electric chair at the time. How many people who go to death row do we have a good opinion of? So Jesus was not only famous and popular, but for many he was also infamous. And when we consider the resurrection, we think about the empty tomb. There's two sides to this story. And when we think about the empty tomb, we think about both sides of the story, those who really loved him and those who really hated him. No matter who it is, if you were in the first century and you had heard about or seen or known of Jesus and somebody came up to you and said, I saw that guy alive again, how likely would it be that you would believe it? We sit here in church, right, and we hear this story, the death, burial, and resurrection, Jesus coming out of the tomb. We hear it so often, it becomes kind of commonplace, and we don't realize how absurd this story is. and not just absurd, but how impactful this story is. If Elvis is still alive, great, he's not singing anymore. Maybe somebody can convince him. But if Elvis is still alive, what impact does that have? If Osama is still alive, maybe a little more impact there, maybe a little more concern there. If Jesus is alive, and if he is who he says he is, and if he can do things like heal the sick of any disease, raise other people from the dead as he did Lazarus, cast out demons from people who other people couldn't restrain. If Jesus is the Son of God, can do all those things, died on the cross, and came back to life, that would be something. But that's a difficult thing to believe, because people don't come back from death. When we think about the problems, the plagues in our world, and we've got things like cancer, and car accidents, and health problems of all kinds. We've got relationship problems, marriage problems. We've got abortion. We've got all sorts of issues that plague our world. But the one thing that plagues our world the most and really ties all those other things together is death. And if Jesus can conquer death, then that's really something. If Jesus really did come back to life, that's really something. See, with Elvis or Osama bin Laden, the claim is not that they came back to life. The claim is that they never died in the first place. When we get to Jesus, though, the claim is actually much, much different. He was dead in a tomb. Everybody knew that. And yet, here comes some people later saying, no, I saw him alive again 3 days later. And so, Paul says that this is of first importance. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we're going to be in this chapter all morning. So, and by all morning, I don't mean hours and hours, but I do mean at least for the extent of the sermon. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says, in verse 3, I deliver to you of what is of first importance. I want to tell you something that is the most important thing. First importance. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, who's Peter, and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Think about a minute what Paul is saying here. He's saying that this man who is famous and infamous, and everybody knows who he is, and everybody knows that he was crucified on a Roman cross. His execution was public. You can go look it up in the records. You can go find somebody in that day and time when Paul's writing these words. You could find somebody who had witnessed that resurrection, or witnessed that crucifixion, and they could tell you about it. They could tell you about the suffering and the agony and the beating and him carrying his cross through the streets. There were plenty of people who saw that. You could find somebody who said, I know for sure that he's dead. But Paul says something pretty incredible. He says you could also go find somebody. In fact, you could find 500 plus 12 plus me, at least, who would tell you that Jesus is alive again. Paul makes an incredible claim that he says is of first importance. And when we think about the good news, when we think about the gospel message, which is why we're all here, this is what Paul says it is. This is the good news that we gather here to remember and to be talked to about and to remind each other about. This is the good news that our world needs to hear. That Jesus died, but he came back to life. That fact is what brings us together as Christians. And that fact influences and touches our entire world. And I want to spend some time thinking about that this morning. So good news. Good news, but also hope. When we think about this story of the gospel, I think about hope. But I also use the word hope in a lot of different ways, especially this time of year, especially in the South, and especially this year, because for some reason, I love fall, but it's just not coming. I mean, 80-degree weather, 90-degree weather in October is just uncalled for, in my opinion. We need something else. So I hope that fall weather comes soon. And we throw that word around a lot, right? I hope that such and such happens. I hope that the Broncos win their football game today. Right, Kylie? Somebody, who snorted? Somebody didn't like that. Hope they weren't snorting. I hope that I will get a piece of cake later. We got a bunch of family here. We had a combined birthday party, and we had a really good cake that Sarah made. I hope that I'll get a piece of cake later. I hope for a lot of things, right? That's not exactly what that word means, is it? I mean, if that's what the word hope means in the Bible, then there's not much hope in that. If I'm hoping for fall to come, well, it just may not come. We might skip it and go right into winter. I could hope for something bigger. I could hope for the lottery, to win the lottery. And that would be nice. That's something to hope for, right? All that money, financial freedom, be able to help people, and that's pretty significant. But is it likely to happen? Somebody said no. You're right. No, Asa. That's a smart boy right there. He must have good parents who give me funny eyes. Hope. Hope has got to be something more than the lottery, because the lottery is significant, and it could change your life, and it could change a lot of lives, although it may change it in bad ways if the stories are true. But nevertheless, it's a pretty significant thing to want, to hope for. But is it likely to happen? No, and that's not either what the Bible talks about when the Bible tries to give us hope. So I want you to think about this picture instead. And I want you to imagine that on this day, you are buried underneath the rubble. You've already made that phone call to your loved one before the phone lines quit working, saying, I'm stuck in here. I don't know if I'm going to get out. And I just want to tell you I love you. And now you're stuck underneath the rubble of the World Trade Centers. And as you're lying there thinking, this is it, this is the end, I've said my goodbyes, I've made peace with it, you start to hear voices, maybe see some lights through the cracks, and you hear some rescuers coming. And they get closer and closer, and you call out, and they answer you. What kind of hope would you have in that moment? It's not anything like. It's not. I don't know why we use the same word, because it's not even the same thing as the lottery. Hoping for that. It's not even the same thing as hoping that this summer weather would go away and we would finally have fall, Josh. Finally have fall. It's not even the same. Why do we use the same word? This gets us a little bit closer to the kind of hope that we have in the gospel. And not to minimize this event at all, and not to minimize that hope at all, but think about that for just a minute. Think about this idea of hope here in this picture for just a moment. If that person gets rescued, they're going to die again. Because our world is still plagued by death, one way or another. It's going to happen to us all. What if, though, we could kill death? What if death died and death was no more? That would solve this problem. That would solve the lottery problem. That would solve a lot of problems. That would solve really all of our problems in our world. And that's the good news. That's the hope that Jesus really promises. That's the hope that the crucifixion and the resurrection coming out of that grave, that's the promise here. That death has been destroyed. That death has been defeated. That death has been killed. Death gets thrown in the book of Revelation. Death gets thrown along with Satan into the lake of fire. Do you remember that? Think about that. Death gets burned up in a lake of fire one of these days. It hasn't happened yet, We still have to deal with death and all the problems in this world in the meantime. But that's the hope. And it's not a hope like the lottery, I wish it would happen. It's a hope like it's already a done deal, because Jesus already rose from the dead. That's why this book was written. That's why the Gospels were written. That's what this whole story of the Bible is about, from beginning to end. This problem that in the beginning, people messed things up. They had it great. They had a garden, a perfect Eden to live in, and messed it up with sin, and now we die. Now we die, and there's not anything we can do about it. But then Jesus comes and solves the problem. In 1 Corinthians, again, chapter 15, skip on down to verse 20. Don't skip it for good. Go back and read it later. It's really good stuff. But for the sake of time this morning, so we're not here all morning. Verse 20, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. How can he say, in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead? How can he say that's a fact? Because look at all these witnesses. At least 500 people. Go find one. Not us today, but them, the people he's writing to. If he couldn't support this claim, how could he write it? Why would we still have this book today if it wasn't true? People could have gone and asked somebody, did you really see Jesus alive? They could have figured it out that this wasn't true, but since it is true, and since we have this book today, Paul says it's a fact. Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The first fruits, such an important idea here. I'm not a farmer, I'm not the son of a farmer. I know some of you are. I know some of you know better the idea of first fruits. But when you get that first harvest, now I have gardened before, not always successfully, but when I get that first haul out of my garden, the first fruits, I know that there's more to come. Well, for me, I don't know that there's more to come because I'm not a great gardener. But if you were doing your job right, that first harvest that you bring in is the first fruits. It's a promise of more to come. And that's exactly what Paul is saying here. Jesus rose from the dead, and that's a promise of more risings from the dead to come, more resurrections to come. In fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. Paul makes such an incredible, important point here. This is very important. Think about what Paul is saying here. We didn't always have death. Just try to imagine, before death came along, if somebody came to you and said, if you can imagine this scenario, if you were with Adam and Eve in the garden, somebody came up to you and said, you know, one day people are going to die. You're like, what does that mean? Right? Death was a novel concept at one point. Death was introduced into our world. It was new. And so all Paul's doing is, he's saying, remember that. Think about that fact that death was new at one point, and now it's commonplace. Death was introduced through the one man Adam, and now it's commonplace. You think today that resurrection from the dead is an absurd idea. But it's just being introduced. And it will become commonplace. And we will get just as used to the idea of resurrection from the dead as we are of death itself. Paul's making a very important point here. He's trying to help these readers who are struggling with this idea that to them is so absurd that people could rise from the dead, that Jesus could rise from the dead. It's so absurd to them, and Paul's saying it's not that absurd. If you think that's absurd, then death itself is absurd. It's new to somebody at some point, and this is just the beginning. Jesus rose from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, first fruits of those who have also died. For as in Adam, verse 22, all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive. Those of us who are in Christ don't have to worry about death anymore, even though it still plagues us, and even though it is still painful, we're going to overcome it. We're going to come back from it just as Jesus came back from it. And not in a, I hope it's going to happen lottery sort of way, and not in a spirit me away sort of way, but in a Jesus came bodily, physically out of a grave and was a whole human being again. And then lived forever. In that kind of way. That's the resurrection we're talking about here. That's the resurrection that Paul is trying to teach to his audience here, that they're having such a hard time wrapping their heads around, so much so that they say, oh yeah, Paul, if people really do come back from the dead, and if they died, say, in a fire and they're all burned up, Yeah, how is that going to happen, Paul? And Paul says, you foolish people. Don't you know that you put a seed in the ground and it's just a hole, a husk, and it comes up something completely new and different? Same thing with resurrection. Put that dead body in the ground and it will come back to life and it will be transformed and it will be kind of the same, but it will be a whole lot different, and you will be resurrected. You will be alive again, and alive to never die again. So you think about Jesus' resurrection. I mean, it wasn't the only resurrection, right? Even not long before Jesus' resurrection himself, he had gone and raised a friend of his, Lazarus, from the dead. But what happened to Lazarus after he was raised from the dead? Just like the person trapped in the World Trade Center that's rescued. Lazarus died later. But Jesus never died again. That's the resurrection that we're talking about. Let's talk about victory. All of these words, all these pictures I've chosen because I want us to also see, as we think about the idea of the gospel, we think about the idea of resurrection especially, this concept just permeates our world. It's everywhere, these ideas that we're talking about. They're all parodies and they're all partial ideas. They're not the real thing, but this idea is such a part of our human story because God has put it in us that we use it and we think about it and we connect with it in so many levels. From, I hope I win the lottery, to connecting to the stories of victims who were rescued from World Trade Centers, to all sorts of stories that are very, very similar to the true story of good news, the true story of rescue, the true story of victory. And of course, you know by now that I like the Denver Broncos. And I love the fact that they won the Super Bowl. Chiefs fans. I love that this year because the Chiefs are a whole lot better than us. But when I think about the Super Bowl, and as much as I love to see my Broncos win, and I still like to watch them when they lose, when I think about that kind of victory, I get a little, I guess, embarrassed at times. Because that gives me a lot of joy, but is that true victory? I should say yes as a Broncos fan. Really, I should, but it's not. See, in our world, we have all these concepts from the gospel that we connect with. Why do so many people like to see this? Why do so many people like to see Peyton Manning, who worked hard his career and did such a great job late in his career, and then he overcame and he was victorious? Why do so many people, even not Broncos fans, connect with this story? It's because of the gospel message. Because God has put that story into our hearts and into our lives so that we connect with it on so many levels. My full-time job now is basically in marketing. I make websites and advertisements. I run a design team for a marketing firm, mainly for RV dealers and selling their RVs. And so I see this kind of stuff all the time. And I'm on the internet all the time, and so I see ads like this one all the time, and I'm sure you've not that one. I'm sure you've seen ads like this too. I have no idea what that prickly stuff is, but I can guarantee you it doesn't cure cancer. Right? But why do they use these images? I mean, it's such a bold promise. Why would people believe it and click on it and say, oh, it's got to be true, that prickly fruit's got to be the answer? Why would people do that? Because this story of the gospel is so much a part of us. God made it a part of our world and a part of us that we connect with it. And people abuse that, and they make silly ads like this, and they make people click, and they tell them lies. Because we want to believe that we'll be victorious, especially over something like cancer. Because we all have loved ones who've been affected by cancer. We all have people in our lives that we know have struggled with this. And we want victory over it. We want relief from it. We want to overcome it. And so we watch the Super Bowl because of victory. And we click on ads like this because we want victory. We want relief. We want rescue. We want to be able to overcome the problems that plague our world. The world is constantly trying to use this to its advantage. Satan is constantly trying to use this to his advantage. But the true story of the gospel is about true victory. And so Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15, still. Bet you weren't going to guess that. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 54. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? I heard a preacher, author, John Smith. Some of you probably read his books before. My Mother Played the Piano is one of his more well-known books. I heard him preach a sermon one time, and his wife, his first wife, died from cancer. And I heard him give a sermon one time talking about that and its effects on his life, and about how despite that, he doesn't give away tons of his money to cancer research and all that, even though he doesn't think that those are necessarily bad. But in his mind, cancer is just a symptom of the bigger problem. And the Bible teaches us that cancer and car accidents and health problems and all these other struggles in our world are just a symptom of the bigger problem, which is death. And so Paul tackles that problem because Jesus tackles that problem, because the gospel tackles that problem, which is the central problem for all of us. If we could fix the problem of death, then we could fix our world. Right? And so after Paul has said, this is the most important thing. Jesus died for your sins, was buried, 3 days later came back from the dead. Most important. Why is that most important? Because that fact, that event, was the blow that defeated death. And it's not done yet. The work is not done. It'll happen one of these days. In fact, a little bit earlier in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about that, about how Jesus was given authority to go and conquer all of the rulers and authorities, the evil rulers and authorities in our world, and the last enemy to be defeated will be death. So back in verse 24, then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule and every authority and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. Death is going to be destroyed. Death is going to die. Death is going to be overcome. And then we'll live forever. We don't have to worry about death anymore. That's what hope is about. That's what the good news is about. That's what true victory is. Overcoming this problem of death. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 42. So is it with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. He's talking about us. Our bodies, our spirits, our soul. He's talking about us. What is put in the ground, that shell that died comes back to life and is imperishable and lives forever. Verse 43, it is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown in natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. You're put in the ground, but you're going to come back to life. That's the good news of the gospel. That's the good news that our world needs to hear. That's the good news that we need to share. That's the good news that we gather around the table of the Lord's Supper to remember. That's the good news that draws us together as a family, that we encourage each other with. When things get hard and when it's really tough and we just want to give up, the good news is death has already been defeated and death will be destroyed. So whatever it is you're going through now, Paul says is a light and momentary affliction compared to the eternal weight of glory in eternity. So finally, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51. If you haven't been following along, I encourage you to read this part with me. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall all be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? Where's the sting of death if death has died? Where's the victory of death and Satan, the wielder of death? Where's their victory if death has been destroyed? Jesus destroyed death on the cross, in the grave, and through the resurrection. And today we connect with that not only in the Lord's Supper, not only in our fellowship together, singing songs about it to one another, encouraging one another with these words, as Paul would also say about these things. Encourage one another with these words. Your loved ones will come back from the dead. Those that you're mourning over, you'll get to see again. Encourage one another with these words. But there's one more thing that is so important that's connected to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and that's baptism. Baptism is a very picture of this, being put down into water, being drowned, essentially, and then being raised up as a new person, as Jesus was raised from the dead. When we become a Christian, when we put our faith in Him, when we make that public proclamation, yes, I belong to Jesus, we reenact that very thing that will happen to us when Jesus returns. And we spread the good news that death has been destroyed. So this morning I encourage you, whatever struggle you're going through, it's not minimal, it's not easy, but there is hope. Not lottery hope and not hope falls coming hope, but real hope. And there's victory, not Super Bowl victory, as nice as that is, but real victory, real good news. Elvis was a great guy, I guess. He's a good singer. Jesus is better. This morning, if we can help you, encourage you, if you're struggling in any way, if we can pray for you, if you'd like to be baptized or put on Christ so that you too can be raised from the dead to never die again and live forever, come forward now. Let us help you while we stand and sing.